What a week it's been, hasn't it, Jeff? It just feels like a month worth of news or even a year's worth of news. I mean, when we were last on this show, um, Biden was still not only president, which he apparently still is now, but he was still the Democratic nominee for president. And he was out there saying that that wasn't going to change. And all of a sudden, it changed.
Well, first of all, I thought it was kind of funny because we named our last episode. It's actually been a little bit longer than we wanted to go without filming a new show, but I believe we named it Biden Death Watch. And the idea behind that was we certainly felt what was coming, but it's probably worth maybe. I think it's just kind of, it's easy to lose the moment and the momentiveness, the momentum. I can't even say the word. The pure significance of the moment. It's easy to look past that. And every now and then I kind of have to pinch myself and really remind myself that, oh my gosh, we're just going through incredible times. The kind of thing that will be a focus perhaps of history as people look back. And the idea of what happened, Biden's tweets, even though we know he's not the one sending them, his interns are, there's literally one day between, I'm going to keep fighting for you and I'm in it to win it kind of tweet and his resignation letter. And we know what happened there. I mean, he was effectively kneecapped by his own party. It was Obama that did probably the hardest kneecapping. But to kind of witness what's gone on, and this Democrats are always talking about democracy, and this was anything but democracy.
The period, you're quite right. It's sort of, we're living through it, but it hasn't perhaps sunk in yet how momentous it all is.
That was the word I was trying to say so hard.
I think the period from June 27th, which was the debate, to July 21st, which is when someone said that Biden wasn't going to be running, those 3.5 weeks were among, the most crazy times in U.S. politics ever. I mean, they're obviously real assassinations that ended in presidents dying and so on. So I don't want to kind of diminish that, but in between that time, we also had a former president, a leading candidate, nominee for the Republicans, getting shot, not only shot at, but actually hit, and all of that within that 3-week period. And let's try and unpack it here. So up until June 27th. Biden, we were told, was sharp as a tack. He was the guy. Everyone was totally behind him. He's, going to be president for another 4 years. Anyone who says otherwise is a conspiracy theorist. He is totally with it. He's not senile at all. These videos that show him to be senile were apparently edited, which they weren't, and so on. Anyway, all that ended just like that in one fell swoop during this debate. And I couldn't believe it when when the debate was over and they went back to the CNN studio, and they were all chastising Biden. He's done for. I was like, what? It was the most amazing moment watching CNN that evening, because you wouldn't believe it was CNN. It was just absolutely incredible how they all just flipped in almost. I don't want to. I'm not conspiratorial about it. I think it has to do with his performance, but didn't you feel it was almost like they scripted it?
I actually do think they scripted it, because what I think back to is the performance that everybody was pointing out to was during his fundraiser, and that was really the critical moment. We know factually that despite everybody everybody in the left telling everybody on the right that they were insane for noting that Obama appeared to have to lead Biden off the stage. We know from Clooney's op-ed that actually Clooney was like taken aback, aghast at how Biden was in person during that weekend. And I think that was kind of the make or break weekend for Biden, and he failed the test. And it was at that point they decided, hey, we got to take him out. I think with hindsight, and we speculated on this, but with hindsight, it's easier to say with certainty that the debate wasn't the make or break point. That had already been decided. The debate was the public performance where Biden was supposed to go out and basically hang himself so that you could go ahead and make the change. And I don't know if they did adjustments with medication or whatever, but Biden came out and instantly everybody knew, like we knew which Biden we got. And the performance that came forth was exactly what happened. One thing before we go on, though, it's amazing how quickly things have kind of gotten lost, is the fact that we did have an assassination attempt on President Trump. And that was the focus. And I worry a little bit that all the talk of Kamala and everything is kind of allowing that to get pushed to the side. There's so much coming at us right now in terms of news and in terms of events. And, the congressional hearings going on every day. It's nonstop. We had the riots yesterday in the Capitol. I think there's probably an overt attempt to shift focus away from the assassination on Trump. I don't know what you think, but my take is that what they really wanted to have is they wanted Trump to have been, I think they wanted him out, assassinated. And I think they wanted to take Biden out. And they think they wanted to have a clean slate, and they didn't get it. And they had to make do with what they can. And now we're in the midst of this political chaos with this fabrication of Kamala as a candidate, and all the enthusiasm that we're seeing out there. I don't think it's for Kamala. I think it's really simply that there's just a candidate they can unify around, and the celebration and the euphoria is that they don't have to deal with Biden anymore. And Kamala's far from perfect, but at least they can fall in line behind her.
Well, she's not senile, so
low bar test, but right.
If Barr, why do I call him Barr? If Biden had showed up to the debate and just kind of regurgitated some sentences that he'd been fed earlier, and it needn't have been very good, and the sentences needn't have been very appropriate to whatever was being asked. Doesn't matter, as long as he's able to just articulate something, anything, just finish a sentence. That would have been enough, and they would have called it a draw, and they would have moved on, and they probably would have stuck with him. But as you said, that's not the Biden that we got. So I think, there's a few things going on. The debate was sort of the trigger. We can argue about whether it was a planned trigger or not. Doesn't matter, but that obviously triggered a huge shift. So that was the starting point. And then you had the media suddenly being honest for this period, this 3-week period, from the debate to Biden dropping out, is just going to be looked at again and again by historians, long after we're all dead. And it's just going to be seen as some of the most fascinating sort of events ever to unfold. The media suddenly became truthful. It was just unreal how they completely, and without any shame, suddenly they were like, yeah, well, we all kind of knew Biden was senile. It's obvious he can't be the candidate and so on. And unfortunately, I think some people were thinking, oh, finally, the media has seen the light and now they're going to be honest. No. They were just honest for this very short period of time because they wanted to get rid of Biden. That was the whole point of it. And then as soon as Biden dropped out, the media flipped back again to its old ways, because that's just the way they are. And now we're back to the lies and the hypocrisy and the propaganda and so on. Suddenly, Biden was the best president ever, so fantastic, so brilliant and so on, and so selfless to drop out and so on. The exact opposite of what they were saying, just a few days ago. So we have the media aspect as well as part of these 3 weeks. And as you said, of course, the assassination attempt, which, yeah, it's kind of just moved on out of the headlines. And I think one of the reasons they got Kim Cheetle, that DEI director of the Secret Service, to resign, even though they weren't going to fire her. She should have just resigned immediately. That didn't happen. They held on to her. That by they, I mean Democrats or whoever runs the White House these days, which, by the way, we can get back to. We don't know. And then she testified. It was a train wreck. And then she resigned. And I agree with you. Most of everything we see has to be seen through the prism of trying to move on from the assassination attempt. Like, let's not talk about that. Let's just talk about Kamala or whatever.
Yeah, let's just pretend that didn't happen. On the media, I don't look at them as being honest. I look at them as, I think I sent something out. I guess I'd have to amend it now, but lying about lying about lying. And now I guess it's lying about lying about lying about lying. Add another one in there. because I mean, really what they were trying to do is they were trying to take out Biden, and at the same time, they were trying to pretend like they were taken by surprise, right? That was the big narrative is, oh, we had no idea. Well, of course they had an idea. They knew perfectly well. And that's a whole nother element to all of this, is that the DNC, the leaders of the DNC, everybody in the White House, all of his staff, all of Kamala's staff, and importantly, Kamala herself, all knew what kind of state Biden was in and had been in. And they were with routine lying to the American public about not only Biden's cognitive ability, but about who was running the country. And, I think we mentioned this before, but we had Kamala literally hold a press conference after Robert Hur released his results. And said basically Biden was too senile to charge, and went and gave a press conference defending Biden, saying that he was as sharp as he ever was. She talks with him every single day, and he's cognitively with it, and he's all there, and Hur's hallucinating, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 4 months later, that was in March. And, now she's basically part of the coup to take him out. And, I don't know about you, but that's something I've been sending messages to kind of, the contacts that I have about, hey, you guys in the GOP, don't let this go. I mean, Kamala was complicit in covering up and basically giving us a shadow government. Let's not lose sight of that either. Let's not lose sight of what happened to Trump, and let's not lose sight of what happened to an American presidency.
Right. Now, one of the reasons why I think that what happened at the debate was not necessarily planned that way, and I think we discussed this a bit on that previous show where we kind of predicted exactly what was going to go down in terms of Biden having to step aside or being pushed aside and so on, is that the end result is not great for Democrats. I mean, ideally, they needed the Biden from 2020, the one who was already senile, but who was still able to string together, the odd sentence. And, we remember him during that debate in 2020. He was, able to respond. It wasn't very good or anything. And you could see that, he was struggling, but, it was passable. They needed that Biden just to get through to November. Then they would have done their fortification and, ballot harvesting, all the usual stuff, maybe gotten over the line, and that's when they replace him. Because obviously Kamala is far from your ideal candidate. And as we discussed on that previous show, there was never going to, I mean, I know people said, then they can choose a new candidate. That was never, ever, ever going to happen. They were never, ever going to be able to cast her aside. That just simply wasn't going to happen. So it was kind of all options were bad. But then when he totally flubbed that debate, it was just over. They had to get rid of him and had to go with Kamala. Now, the outcome is far from clear, at least in my view. I think some people on the Republican side are, a bit too optimistic. I think they underestimate what we're already seeing, the beginnings of how Kamala is now, the best thing ever. Kamala the Great, never did anything, just the perfect candidate and so on. The exact opposite of what they were saying just a short while ago. They'll try and push her along, but of course, 4 months is a long time in politics, and she'll probably, flub as well. And there's going to be problems that then they'll push back, and then, I think it's going to be very, very close. No matter what happens.
Yeah, well, you and I have talked about this offline, off of the way, just outside of this. And, we maybe have a little bit of a differing opinion, but it's always good to bounce these things back and forth. And I think your warnings are, really worth taking to heart. My own position is that Kamala is kind of at her peak right now. And it's simply what she's experiencing is this sort of Democrat euphoria over having a candidate that they can rally around. They don't care about Kamala. It's not about Kamala. It's simply that it's not Biden. And my own prediction and guess is that she's probably at her all-time high right now, or maybe over the next week or two. It could be a little more time for momentum to build, but we're toppy. We're right there. And that the more she talks, the more that is to our benefit and her detriment. And that's going to start moving her downhill. I saw somebody tweet something yesterday that I thought was great. And it was something to the effect of, if the GOP has any brains, they'll be buying Kamala airtime. And I saw that and I just had to laugh and send it out because I agree with that completely. Yeah, she's a lot more polished right now. I think we both noted that she's doing better in terms of her presentation, the recent ones we've seen. I have to think there was a huge amount of work in terms of trying to train her over the last couple months and prepare her for this, where she sounds a little bit more polished. But Kamala's still kind of Kamala, and I just got to think she's not likable. What was that, Mama Law or something like? I mean, that was horrific. I just think she's going to find a way to expose herself as the unlikable person she is. My own guess, and I'm curious what your thoughts are here, is I wouldn't be surprised. I refer to her as a possible placeholder. I'm not convinced that we're done with this thing. I don't know. Has Obama come out and endorsed her as of today? I know as of early this morning he hadn't. We're kind of waiting on that. But I guess I just wouldn't be surprised if she's potentially not the final candidate.
I would be. I think they have settled on her. I don't think they can do another switch. I just okay, only if they decide to just throw the whole thing. But then who is going to run instead of her? Who's going to get clobbered? Because they know they're going to get clobbered. There's no way they can do another switch in my view. So I think they're just going to stick it out.
Well, remember, they are worried about down ballot too. They're not just worried about...
Absolutely. In terms of Obama, I mean, my guess is that he is negotiating behind the scenes as to what his role is going to be. You know, all of the people he gets to appoint and all the things he gets to decide and so on. Obviously, not in that way. Not like directly, like I will pick this and this and this. But you know, there's I'm sure there's talks going on behind the scenes as to how they're going to sort of divvy this up, and then you end up with eventually you end up with Obama endorsing her. That's my opinion. Maybe he wants to say on the vice president. Now I know I threw this out a few weeks ago, you know, when we talked here on the show, that if it was Michelle Obama, they would actually win. I'm convinced of that. Now, obviously, it's very, very unlikely to be Michelle Obama, and I'm not even sure that Barack Obama would want that, but for various reasons. But you know, that would just be a winning combination. So anyway, in that line of thinking, maybe Obama wants to have a say on VP. Maybe Obama wants to have a say on various other things. But I think eventually he will come out and endorse.
Well, it's interesting, too, who, you know, some of the people on that list, I'm thinking of like Josh Shapiro or, God forbid, Pritzker, people like that. But like a Josh Shapiro is somebody who shouldn't be the Veep. If she ends up picking him, I don't know what's going to transpire, because that's the kind of candidate that, although unfortunately for her, I think a lot of her choices probably would, you know, pick almost anybody that's going to outshine her. But being guided to somebody like Shapiro makes me wonder, because that's somebody who's vastly superior to her, and it's going to be an interesting pairing to watch that. You know, it's part of the reason I'm just not convinced that this thing is over yet. I feel like what we've been living through is a period in which every single political norm is being shattered, is that we're moving towards this culmination. And it started, you know, a few years back when, maybe a decade ago. It's obviously it's been ongoing for a long time, but it's dramatically accelerated kind of under the Obama years, where we saw congressional norms thrown out the window, the way candidates were, you know, nominees were treated, et cetera, and kind of one by one, every sort of norm and gentlemanly standard has fallen by the wayside. And I feel like Democrats have found that they take a step and they go for something that's you know, a real outlier grab, and then nothing happens. And they realize, like, well, why don't we do it again? Let's go a little further. And this incrementalism has picked up to such a point that, you know, I just, every now and then I'll try to place myself, kind of myself 20 years ago, how I perceived or looked at politics or what was done in politics, and step forward to today to appreciate the magnitude of the change. Presidential elections are, it started in 2000, it seems like to me, but they really have become an absolute brutal war where there almost are no rules. And it's a given that Democrats are going to cheat. It's just a function of, can they cheat enough? I don't think that was necessarily what everybody thought back in the early 2000s. It just, things have changed dramatically.
Oh, absolutely. You're so right about the norms, and it's not just during election years. It's, I mean, Obama was a huge part of that. But if you look at, for instance, the bureaucracy, I mean, George W. Bush is actually responsible for much of that because he expanded the bureaucracy like hugely, and the bureaucracy tends to attract leftist people, just like the teaching profession, other professions, academia, and so on. That's simply in the nature of that job for various reasons. You have you might not be entrepreneurial in your thinking. You might just want your kind of 9 to 5 job. You want the security. You want all these nice things, whatever. And it just seems to attract more of these leftist types. And there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there's leftist types and more conservative types. That's fine. But so you have this inbuilt bias to begin with. So if you're going to hire hundreds of thousands of new people, you're going to have more of them. And you could see how Virginia turned blue under Bush 43, because he did that. And in all of Northern Virginia, the Washington D.C. suburbs, it all became super, super blue because there was all these people there. But Obama took it a step further. He made it overtly political. So, for instance, FBI, DOJ, and so we talked about these before, recruiting people not based only on who's good. And again, just inherently, you're gonna, because it's government jobs, you're gonna tend to end up with more leftist people anyway. But then he took it to a whole new level where there was basically a sort of political test in order to work at those institutions and agencies and so on. And I've just picked out those two because we've talked about them and they're so obvious and we see the results now. But you could see that kind of across the board. So that was a huge kind of getting rid of the norms. The norm being you just recruit on a neutral basis, whoever is the most qualified. Then you threw in the DEI stuff. That's a huge kind of that completely shatters the norms as well. So this is all the stuff that goes on outside of the election years, outside of the cheating. And then, of course, you get to the election years. And I completely agree with you. It's every time it's just gotten worse and worse in terms of what's possible and what can be done. I mean, just look at this here. The fact that there was an early debate, that was unthinkable just a few years ago. Debates were always going to be like maybe one at the end of September, but mainly in October. That's just the way it's always been. Boom, now you have one in June for purely political reasons, because Biden wanted to probably, in my view, cement his position just by, well, we had a debate, I'm the nominee, that's it. And then the ones working against Biden thought, well, maybe he's going to totally flub it and then we can replace him, which is exactly what happened. The fact that Biden dropped out, that hasn't happened. I mean, Johnson dropped out in March of 68. And that was seen as a huge thing, like, oh, dropping out so late. Well, now we're in July. So you're absolutely right. The list goes on and on and on. But where does all this lead to? When you throw away all the norms and all the customs, what you end up with?
Well, I mean, that's why you have norms, right? So you have sort of a civil society. There's a reason that you have these established ways of doing things that people abide by, these traditions. And it's, if you think about what the goal is, I always see it through a Marxist lens, that the left is always kind of operating from this Marxist set of principles. And I always point my finger back to Theodore Adorno, the Italian philosopher who kind of trickled through Frankfurt School guys, etc., Alinsky, all the way down to today. And, that they've always operated through a mode of incrementalism. Let's just slowly try to pervade all, the thrust was, let's break the institutions and let's do it slowly over time so that people don't really notice until it's too late. And I feel like we're kind of at that too late element now. You talked about the institutions in terms of the changes that were made at the federal agencies, and that every single federal agency within the government has now been thoroughly polluted. And they do attract leftists, but it didn't used to be this incredible imbalance, because those positions do, although they attract a certain type, they also attract, for the political appointees, they attract qualified individuals, because everybody knows that if they get one of those, nice political appointments and operate at the fairly high level in the government, that then they're set for life in the private sector after that. So, they go for the cachet and sacrifice the money to make the money later on. And so there's always a lengthy list of willing applicants. And, we saw that with the DOJ, where they staffed them with 100%, not just leftists, extreme leftists, and did it in such a way that now that structure's been built and enabled, and it's very difficult to tear down because those are the people doing the hiring. If all of the DOJ has been turned into a progressive left, and that's just a litmus test for all the other federal agencies, once they've been placed into this extreme progressive left category, that's what it's going to be. They're doing the hiring. It's very difficult to overcome that. Trump ran smack into that. Obama was so effective at thoroughly polluting every federal agency that when he brought his people in at the very top, they couldn't even do anything. They couldn't change the culture. They found it, not only couldn't they change it, but they found that culture aligned against them and sort of intuitively operating against them the entire time. So that's a huge concern. If Trump does win this, I certainly hope that he comes in with the attitude of like, I just don't care. I'm, coming in to rain down fire and brimstone, and I don't care what the political ramifications are, just slash and burn. So we are at a really difficult point, and it makes this election so crucial as well, which I guess just, everybody recognizes that. It's not like just you and I are saying this. Everybody feels that on both the right and the left. The left feels like we're at a point where we could have everything we've done torn down, and the right feels like if we don't win this election, we've lost everything, we've lost our country. And so it's just kind of open warfare right now. It's a crazy time.
To be fair, I think it gets said a lot, like, oh, this election is the one that, decides everything, is the most important, whatever. I remember that was certainly the case in 2004. And it was basically about, Iraq, stay in, go out, all that kind of stuff, the war, anti-war, the whole post 9/11 and so on. In the end, it didn't prove to be that, momentous, because let's face it, John Kerry, George W. Bush, compared to what we have today in the political landscape, there wasn't much of a difference between those two guys. But anyway, every election, we were told the same thing. But it just sort of, I make the point because you are right. I mean, it is actually getting more serious, and this election is actually more important than the previous ones. It's not just some kind of platitude that we just get out every 4 years. But I still want to kind of focus on why is it that important, and what is this point about getting rid of all the norms, and what's the grander scheme here? And I think we've talked about this before, that it's that the left, and the progressive left especially, just wants to destroy everything because they want to renew, but not renew in any positive, good way that we would usually associate with that, but renew in a sort of the global governance model, which, by the way, is also where this whole climate thing comes from. That the only way you can solve the supposed climate crisis is by having a world government and world rules. And so I don't think that every progressive leftist thinks that through, like sits there and goes, oh, I want a world government or whatever. But I think that's the mindset. That's what's in there. That's what's in their heads. That is what we should strive for in general, without necessarily being able to articulate it specifically. So that's where this comes from. Because I ask myself often, why would you want to destroy the norms? Why would you want to let criminals go free? Why would you want to let illegals come in? Why would you want to do all those things? And that's basically the only answer that I can come up with.
Well, I mean, I've said this a bunch of times, but I view it as it's an attack primarily on the Constitution. And, I mentioned Adorno. I mean, it goes back to that. There was a time when they were trying to bring Marxism to the United States, and they were unsuccessful. And what they realized is that the way the United States was structured with its constitution, its heavy reliance on its constitution at the time, it had created an environment where workers had plenty of upward mobility. And so they were having no success trying to implement that. And that's how we got started. And it's the Constitution that is their goal. It is their target. It is their enemy. And then to the extent that you defend the Constitution, then you're their enemy as well. So anybody who's trying to fight to uphold and keep the Constitution, forefront, that then you're the enemy for having done that. You mentioned world government. The goals are basically supranational laws that supersede, stand above the Constitution. And the reason that they want those is because they're trying to ascend above the authority of the Constitution and push it down, create, world courts, et cetera, et cetera. The UN, all of those things are goals to basically rise above the Constitution, push the Constitution's authority down. And I think that really that's what stands in the way. America has always stood in the way of globalism, but it stood in the way of globalism because of the Constitution. And that is, in my mind, that is their target. Everything runs through that prism. How can we erode and tear down the Constitution of the United States from a global perspective? Because that's what stands in the way of all their other goals.
And conversely, it's America that allows America based on the Constitution that allowed this globalism thing to get started in the first place. There's this cliche about the American policeman, the world's policeman, right? But it's actually true. Of course, there's the cliche part, but if you dig down, there's a lot of it that is actually true, where you need someone to guard for instance, the marine traffic. You look at what happened, what's going on in Yemen and so on. You can't use all the ships are now going around South Africa because they can't go through there. Well, some still do, but it's no longer protected. You got if you imagine a world without the United States and without the United States military, there would be so much chaos that you couldn't have globalism because you couldn't have the shipping routes. You couldn't have all these things that you have now. You couldn't have this sort of relative stability because you would have a lot of bad actors causing a lot of problems, China and so on and so forth. But you would who are no longer constrained at all. But you would also have piracy and all that. So the fact that there isn't this massive chaos, or hasn't been for a long time, is down to the US. And it's down to the fact that the US is such a successful country, which is down to the Constitution, that it can do those things. Now, you take that away and it all breaks down. So any idea of a global government or let's do things globally, whatever, totally collapses where you don't have the United States kind of keeping the order. That just doesn't work anymore. So they're kind of working against their own goals there. But I just don't think they thought it through.
Well, I mean, I think ultimately they want chaos as much as possible as a tool to achieve their ultimate goal. There's chaos until they can actually achieve this world order. And the U.S. has participated in a lot of that in the sense of these, never-ending wars, etc. We, in many respects, we've been a party to that. Now that's been driven by certain individuals, kind of the neocon element, etc. But if you look at the neocon element, they probably end up falling over in the globalist camp anyway. But they want to foment this kind of instability, both for profitability and I think for the longer term goal of pushing towards the need for this one world government, which of course it's kind of, communism sounds great in theory, in a sense that everybody works and everybody benefits and everybody's taken care of. That's wonderful, except for the simple intrusion of human nature, and that's not how humans function or work. So when it comes face to face with the practicalities of how we are actually created, that all falls down. I mean, that's why communism doesn't work and never will work.
And that's exactly right in terms of why this global outlook or global government, whatever you want to call it, is never going to work because it doesn't fit with human nature. So let's say everything is destroyed. Let's say we end up in a post-apocalyptic world, the one you see in the movies and so on, because let's skip ahead like 50, 100 years, whatever. United States is no longer keeping the order because it has too many problems of its own. And we're getting there, debt and strife and all these kinds of things, these daily political battles that we talk about. It's not going to happen in the next few years, but, eventually we'll get there. So the United States is no longer keeping order. No one else is keeping order. The things we just talked about start collapsing. The shipping routes are no longer patrolled as, you got piracy, you got rogue states, you got lots and lots of problems. So let's say you end up eventually with this chaos that the left is seeding. Well, if it ever reconstitutes itself, it's not going to start as a world government or reconstitute itself as a world government. It's in human nature to start reconstituting itself in small groups. We can see that throughout all of human history. So what would happen in a post-apocalyptic world is that we kind of start from square one with small groups here, small groups there, and so on. And then you would just go through the whole motions again. So if you're ever going to have world government, it has to come from stability and strength. So the idea of causing problems and chaos is not going to lead them to where they think it's going to lead them.
Yeah, and it's like you said earlier, I think, that most of the people are sort of operating on, I don't think you used the word autopilot, but that's kind of what you were implying, is that they were going along, they see things in bits and not seeing the whole. And I think that's true for the most part. Unfortunately, it doesn't take that many people who are well organized themselves to kind of filter that through. And when you extrapolate that out over kind of the nature of Democrats, that there's driven by emotion, no pure ideology to speak of. You're sort of grouped together almost by the fact that you don't have an ideology, and you're emotionally driven, and you can be rallied up over whatever the latest thing they're trying to make is the current narrative. It's very easy to control those groups and just drive them in the process that you want to have them driven. Well, they have no idea that they're being driven towards something, and always being done in the name of something good, a nice sounding name that has an entirely different set of motivations behind it. So it's going to be interesting. I personally, I'll introduce this and then stop because we don't need to go into it, but 50 years out, I kind of feel like we're going to have an AI god that's going to be taking care of everything, and maybe all those bets are off. We'll see how that plays out, but that whole element's accelerating as well. And I don't think a lot of people are thinking about that much at this point, but we'll see.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's more likely that we'll end up with a post-apocalyptic something at some point. But again, long after you and I are dead.
Maybe by that mechanism.
Very, very long timeline here. Essentially the left, if we want, I'm going to oversimplify it here, but essentially the left thinks through emotions and the right less so, just on the most basic level.
Emotional logic for simplistic purposes.
Exactly. And there are, there's nuances and this and that, I'm aware of that, but just on a very, very basic level. And that's how you get to having these left and right camps.
You could also argue ideological, non-ideological.
Right. And you can't overcome that. I mean, you can't I often ask myself, for instance, economically speaking, right? It's very, very, very obvious which economic policies work and which do not work. And the conservative ones work and the other ones don't. Now, again, there's nuances and this and that, but generally speaking, that's just always been that way. It's every time you look at the outcomes, it's always the same way. So then I ask myself, well, why isn't everyone for conservative economic principles? Because those are the ones that lead to the most wealth for everyone. And they just lead to better outcomes for everyone. And the problem is that there are just people, and it tends to be kind of 50-50, who are just more emotional. Everything is driven by emotions, their decisions, their votes, it's just emotional. And this is not a bad thing, and I don't propose to change people or whatever. That has a lot of advantages as well, but that's just something as kind of humanity we have to just contend with. We have to live with that. This is how it is. This is probably embedded somewhere in our DNA. Some people are more so, and other people are less so. Now, as to how all this is going to pan out in the future, I don't know. I like the idea of democracy because you have to kind of find a middle way between the ones who are more emotional and the ones who are not. And again, I prefer not to be emotional, but that's just the reality on the ground. So, okay. And that's worked fairly well for a long time. But as you said, the norms are out of the window. There's a lot of cheating. There's a lot of, because I think if, again, oversimplifying a bit here, the emotional side of humanity or of the country or however wide you want to go has decided, because they're emotional, that their grievances and that their issues and that their concerns and so on are more important than the other side because they are more emotional. Mm-hmm. And that then justifies cheating and ballot harvesting and all these other things. And that's going to be a huge problem unless that's kind of reeled back in. And that, yeah, I mean, you mentioned Trump earlier. I think if he does get reelected, I think there's a much bigger chance this time that he will go and clean up stuff. But that's not going to change the fundamental problem that the left, then you get to skip to 2028 and they'll try the same thing, and 32 and so on. It will. That's something that does concern, I find extremely worrying. That how are we going to overcome that? How are we going to get back to, norms and no cheating? That is,
once norms are broken, how do you reestablish them? They're not norms anymore.
Right. So if you went back to they had this election in France the other week, and it was paper ballots and counted the same night, and that's it. You go there, you make your tick, and you count them. Okay, so you don't have all these shenanigans going on. I'm sure you have some as well, but in general, and always, it's always fascinating to watch all these other countries being able to count this stuff within a few hours. Okay, so is there any cheating going on? Well, not in the ballot harvesting sense or whatever, but there is obviously in terms of the emotional sense, because remember the first round was won by the right in France, but then they have this weird system where you have to have a second round where you whittle down the number of candidates. And then there was a lot of media and emotional push and propaganda and so on. And then the left won the second time around. So this was kind of a more traditional way of dealing with it in a democratic fashion. So again, this is the part I don't think we can overcome. We'll always have many people who vote emotionally, and that's just the way it is. But at least you don't have this kind of cheating. Now, in the US, generally speaking, I always thought it was probably a right-leaning country, and in many ways it probably still is. But if you push at the margins so hard, is with all this mail-in and all the stuff we talked about, well, then you can kind of permanently push it the other way.
I always kind of think about it as both the emotional logic aspects that you're talking about, but also power versus diffusion of power. And kind of at its core, the conservative principle is effectively to push power down. I'm not saying that there aren't plenty on the right that are, thirsty for power. Of course there are. But as a principle, the idea is diffusion of power, where on the left, it's a consolidation of power. And everything is ultimately about power as it manifests itself through money, political power, etc. But it's power. And, centralized government and growing that government and propping that up and exerting control over others. And so you've got those two competing camps that are working with each other. And we're kind of seeing the rise of the autocrat that's really, really alarming. Brussels, with a small group of unelected officials that are exerting their influence over all of Europe and in very harmful ways. And it's like, how do you get rid of those officials? How do you get rid of an unelected autocrat out of Brussels who's dictating everything for the entire European Union without the destruction of the EU? I mean, I think people are suddenly kind of, I don't know if they're waking up, but I think some are, where they're like, oh my God, how did we come to this? We don't really have elections for these people. It's more a matter of whether these vassal states that are now defined as countries, whether they want to participate and accede to that. So that's another area where there's been kind of a slow growth that's reached an area that is now at a dangerous point.
And even the ones who do not want to participate, like Switzerland, are basically forced to participate because, this is not really well known, but if Switzerland did not participate in all the stupid rules coming out of Brussels, well, then they wouldn't be allowed to trade, and they're a landlocked country, and they really don't have a choice. It's kind of the same with the UK after leaving the European Union. They're still forced to abide by all the European Union rules because otherwise the European Union says no trade. So
all the fines that are levied for not going along with the rule making, it's crazy.
It is. Now, one good thing coming out of the EU long run is a good thing in a way of seeing how bad it is that you're right. These are autocrats, but they used to be called, and the media still thinks they're technocrats, and it's being sold as this is a great model for democracy because these people, yeah, okay, they're not really elected and all that, but they're actually technocrats. They do the best thing based on science and math and so on. So it's like we don't want to have this left-right divide, and we don't want to have all this political strife, whatever. We're just going to do exactly the right thing according to, well, math and science and technocrat. Again, that's where this whole concept comes from. But then they're not really that at all. I mean, look at COVID. They pretended to be, by the way, in the US as well, Fauci and all that, they pretended to be technocrats, like, oh, we're just following the lead of science here. But in fact, they were little emperors, and they were just exerting power. There was never any evidence for the masks or the social distancing or the so-called vaccine and all this kind of stuff. No, they just decided that. But because they call themselves technocrats, and because the media helps them with that, they kind of got away with it. And I mean, that's still an ongoing problem. But I think more and more people are seeing the fact that you cannot have that, because ultimately, even if someone has the label technocrat attached to themselves, they're still a human being. They're still going to want power and all those kinds of things. So that brings us back to the point you made a little while ago here, which is, can AI overcome that? Can we have a technocratic AI kind of taking charge of things? I don't know. But based on my experience with AI over the past few years, you can't, because AI is exactly how it's programmed. I don't think we're at the point where AI is actually neutral, and I don't see how we're going to get there.
Well, probably best to save that, largely speaking, but I think that has a way of spiraling out of control. Once AI has the capability to begin programming itself, and you no longer have the need for the high-level, scientists that are doing that, who knows where that goes? That then we're already in an exponential phase, but it becomes supra-exponential, and where that outcome lies for us, I don't know. I'm certainly a little nervous about what it's going to look like 10 years from now. But, kind of bringing it back to sort of the Biden thing, what I was just thinking about was what we were witnessing from all these politicians is the incredible turns that they're willing to go through. The same ones that were lying to everybody, promoting Biden, then they suddenly shifted to Biden is senile and Biden's got to go and we're trying to push him out. They were literally the ones that undercut him. And then the day that he finally accedes to their demands, then there were the ones that were propping him up as the greatest hero and savior of democracy, and Joe's doing the right thing. When that, it's so laughable because they're the ones that undercut him and kneecapped him and took him out of the race, are now eulogizing him as a fantastic guy as they move on, and they're literally fabricating the entire election. The whole process, start to finish, has been anything but about democracy, but it's being done under the pretense of democracy. I mean, even Biden's nomination wasn't a Democratic nomination per se. The way they structured that he could only be the effective nominee. Then when they saw they couldn't get a puppet across the finish line, they engaged in the whole other level of machinations. It's really disturbing to see kind of more nakedly what our political landscape is actually like. That's both the gift and in a way kind of a curse, because it's uncomfortable from Trump to see what things are really like. I mean, I don't know about you, but I look at politics entirely different than I did, say, 15 years ago. Just entirely different. I also feel like I don't even have a party, that I'm out there along with a whole bunch of other people kind of in the wilderness with no true representation, neither from the right nor from the left.
No, I'm with you on that, and there's obviously many things that I never expected to be possible, like the entire upper echelons of the FBI is totally corrupt, and there's no exaggeration in that. I mean, just look at Russiagate. Yeah. If you'd asked me 10 years ago, I'd said, no, of course not. So very much so. But the bigger, and we can sort of maybe close it out on this here. I mean, the bigger concern for me, the bigger worry is the cheating. And the cheating, I don't only mean the voting part, but I also mean the media cheating. And by that, I mean all the propaganda. It's just completely crazy what the media has been doing. I mean, we looked at some examples of how they just flip-flopped during that 3-week period. As soon as Biden was gone, boom, they flipped back. But all the lies, we can go back, Russiagate, Ukraine, everything, just lies, 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 lies. So how can people make informed decisions, even the emotional ones, the emotional people, if the information is incorrect? So that's a huge problem as well. So that to me is part of the cheating as well. So you have the actual what happens on election day or during election year. You have the media lying to people, and you end up with a system where you don't get that, what we used to have, or what I used to think was okay, where we kind of end up in the middle because some people think this way, some people think that way. It's all a bit distorted now. And I don't see how we're going to fix that. Certainly not if the media doesn't stop lying. And then, I think some people thought over the past few weeks, like, oh, whoa, now they're telling the truth about Biden. Maybe they learned their lesson. No, they didn't learn their lesson. They just wanted to get rid of Biden. And now they're back to their old ways. And how are we ever going to fix that? I don't know. How are we ever going to fix the sort of the mail-in and all those kinds of things? Again, I don't know. I think this idea that we have this tug of war and sometimes you win a bit and sometimes you lose a bit is kind of gone now. The left wants it all. And that's just very, very dangerous. So how do you get the left back to the point of well, let's have fair elections again and let's report truthfully about what's going on. And sometimes you'll win and sometimes we'll win. That's the path we ought to try and find. And I'm not going to sit here today and tell you that I know how to find that path.
I feel like one way that could possibly be found is through prosecutions, is through accountability for some of the things that were done. Right now, I feel like the left feels like they can act in unfettered fashion, that there's no pushback, that there's no concerns they have to worry about. They can operate. They've taken those extra steps, and every time they take those steps, they can take another one and another one and another one. And until there's some of those people, and I'm thinking about the lawfare group, that faces actual repercussions where people actually maybe have required to think about what would be the outcome of their actions. If there's not that, then there's no constraints, and there has to be some sort of constraint. That's one way, one mechanism I could think of that being done. You talked about the media. For me, one of the great examples of that was what we just saw, was with Kamala as the border czar. And yesterday I was searching because I knew it was there in some of the executive orders, etc., evidence that Kamala herself understood that she was in charge of the border, and I found it. But what struck me was my initial search pulled up an infinite almost number of pages that were all articles that were written one day ago. In other words, the entire media landscape turned around and went from calling her the border czar to writing hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of articles written in the span of 2 days to go ahead and shape the narrative that she was not the border czar, because it's important to separate her, Kamala, from the border disasters for her presidential aspirations. And the media was all in with that. It was unreal. Go ahead.
Right, and you have to throw in the internet, these internet giants as well that do the distortion as well, and do the lying, and do the turning everything on its head. That we no longer have our old system where we have a bit of a tug of war, where everything is distorted right now. Because the example you just gave is exactly what I went through as well. I think it was yesterday, as you mentioned. I wanted to just find, I know she was border czar, and I know every single media outlet called her that. But as you said, if you search that term, the only results you would get are results from yesterday or the day before, or whatever, because the media flooded the zone with propaganda that she was not the border czar. So then I was like, okay, when did this happen? This was in 2021. Okay, let's just search for that term in 2021. Nope, still, you only got results for yesterday. No, not a border czar, never a border czar, right-wing conspiracy, blah, blah, blah. So in the end, you had to search for an exact date in quotation marks. Don't quote me, I think it was March something. It was March 8th.
It was like March 24th of 2021. That's the date.
All right. So exactly. If you put in the exact date and and you basically programmed your search to only search for that date range and so on, okay, then you would finally get the actual results, which, by the way, are probably being scrubbed as well. And then you have to go to archive.org, which by the way, is fantastic. And I'm sure, we've already seen attacks on that site as well, because that's, in a way, one of the few sites where you can actually go and see what the truth is, what was actually said back then. So yeah, it's that's part of the problem as well, that you have these distortions going on every level. Internet companies, social media companies, the media as a whole, the way elections are run, and of course, bureaucracy, federal government, what we talked about. I mean, the whole, what happened with the FBI and Russiagate is in itself a huge distortion of the truth, how they, came after Trump. Many of the problems that Trump faces now, especially in terms of his image, can be traced back to the FBI and what they did to him back in 2016, 17.
Yeah, well, there's a lot that can be traced back to that period. I ultimately found what I was looking for by going to the White House website and just going back to the beginning of Joe Biden's tenure and knowing when the period was and looking through the actual EOs, as well as Kamala's trip to there's a number of trips down to Central America, and that's where I found what I was looking for, where it was in her own words that she admitted that she'd been placed as, she didn't use the word border czar, but that she had been placed in charge of the border and was supposed to get to the bottom of what the problems were with that. Because as you said, not only was there all the host of new articles, but there was a scrubbing of the old stuff where you just couldn't find what you want. And that gets back to the aspect of control, of power. That's what that is about fundamentally. It's about, exertion over what you can see, information you can consume, and who we want to get into position, because it's all about getting Kamala into the White House. So, we're at a very, very dangerous point right now, and it's scary.
Especially if you get technocratic AI, which is programmed to do all this scrubbing, because it's going to do a hell of a lot better than what's going on right now, the manual scrubbing, because then people like you and I will no longer be able to find these old articles, because then they will truly be scrubbed.
Truly be gone.